Good evening, dear friends. Welcome back to American Spaces Weekly US State Tours. I'm happy to welcome today our special guest, Bill Middleton. Hi, Bill.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, I believe many of you might know Bill because he was the Information Resource Officer for Central Asia back to 2012, coordinating all the American spaces and partner organizations as libraries and universities. And he made a great impact to development of the American spaces in Central Asia. So currently, Bill lives in Portland, Maine, and he's going to present State of Maine. And hope you will inspire uh, most of our audience to visit this wonderful state one day, if you have an opportunity. Yeah. And Bill, we're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will give you the turn to you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and greetings from Maine. There's a thing that I have to say before we start, and it goes like this. I am not an official representative of the U.S. Embassy of the Kyrgyz Republic. Opinions expressed are solely my own and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. Embassy of the Kyrgyz Republic. Okay? And that's it. Now, hi to I can't see you, but hi to everybody that I have met in Kyrgyzstan. I wish I was there. I miss it very much. But let me tell you about where I live now, about Maine. Igarim, could we have the first slide up, please? So,
Okay.
if you ask the average American about Maine, the first thing if you ask the average American what they think of when they think of the state of Maine, they will probably say two things. Number one, it's really, really cold. And number two, they eat lobsters. And so we're going to talk about both of those things a little bit. On this map of the United States, in red up in the upper right-hand corner is the state of Maine. It is the furthest north state on the east side of the United States. Actually, it's not as far north as some of the western states, but it's the furthest north state on the eastern side. It is the most eastern state, so the sun rises first in Maine. It is, strangely enough, because even though it's very, very cold, the state in the United States that's closest to Africa. And I live in the city of Portland, which is the biggest city in Maine, at the bottom of the state. And Portland is slightly north of Bishkek. It's a few hundred kilometers north of Bishkek. So our climates are similar. We have very cold winters and very pleasant summers. Right now it's summer and it's beautiful out. But the winters are cold. The difference in the climate is this: Portland is on the ocean, and that makes the air humid. And we're also at sea level. So it also moderates the climate a little bit. And what that means is in Bishkek, when it's cold, it's colder there. And when it's hot, it's hotter there than it is here in Portland. But it's generally pretty similar. You would be at home here. Could we have the next slide, please? All right, there's a breakdown of the state itself. It only has 3 borders. One border is with the Atlantic Ocean, the state of New Hampshire, and one border is with Canada. Maine is the only state in the United States that only borders one other American state. So that's unusual. The coast is where I live. I live on an island off of Portland, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But there are many islands off of Maine. Some of them have people living on them, and some of them don't. The coast is generally pretty rocky. It's not a nice sandy coast with sandy, warm beaches and palm trees. It's cold with pine trees. And could we have the next slide, please? Here is the official seal of the state of Maine. It has in the middle of it a pine tree. The pine tree is the official tree of Maine, and Maine is also called the Pine Tree State. On the right, you see a sailor. On the left, you see a farmer. And in the middle, you see the word dirigo. That's not a word in English, that's a word in Latin. And what it means is I lead. So that's the motto of Maine, I lead. And it makes sense that there's a sailor on our seal for the state, but the farmer doesn't make that much sense because the farming in Maine is terrible. The land isn't very fertile, it's rocky. Because we're so far north, the seasons are very short. There's a lot of snow. Maine is mostly forest. It's open forest land. So the farmer there is holding a scythe for cutting wheat. There is very little wheat that grows in Maine. But that's our symbol. Nevertheless, let's go to the next slide. Remember when I said it was cold? This is a picture of cold. This is a lighthouse. I know Kyrgyzstan doesn't have any ocean, so let me explain what this is about. They used to build lighthouses along coasts. See that tower? The top of that tower has a very big, very powerful light in it that rotates, that spins around. And if you're looking at it, it looks like it's flashing, but it's really a steady beam that just is circulating around. And that was to warn ships that they were getting near shore, so that they wouldn't crash into those rocks. Maine has many lighthouses because Maine has many rocks, and because sailing was important and still is important to the economy here. I say we used to have lighthouses because they don't really build them much anymore because sailors navigate using computers, using global positioning systems, GPS. They don't really need lighthouses, but they're beautiful, and people visit them for tourist reasons. You can see the house at the bottom of that tower. That's where the lighthouse keeper would live. Sometimes these were on very remote islands. They were always on the edge of the land, obviously, because they faced out to sea. And so lighthouse keepers would have to often teach their own children. They were responsible for their food through the winter because it was hard to get ships in and out to visit them. They were very self-reliant, but it was a lonely job. Sometimes there were no families. It was just the lighthouse keeper who kept that light on. But you see that snow and ice there on the ocean. That's what it looks like here in the winter. It looks cold. And let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is a moose. The moose is the official mammal of the state of Maine. He's sort of like a deer, I suppose, and we have deer in Maine as well, but he's very, very big. You can't tell how big he is here, but he's about 2 meters high at the shoulder, at his front shoulder, and he's about 2 meters long as well. So he's big. He eats a lot of grass. He likes to hang out in the water like that. And he has those big horns. They're generally not dangerous. They're shy. They live in the woods, in the remote parts of Maine. I've never seen one in person, but I like them. I think they're cool. There is a hunting season for them, so people go off and kill them and eat the meat. But yeah, Maine is really the only place on the East Coast that has moose in any number. Alaska also has moose on the other side of the continent. So let's look at the next picture. Oh, I said Americans, when you ask them about Maine, will tell you two things they know about Maine. They know it's cold, and they know they have lobsters. This is a lobster. How many people have ever seen a lobster before? They live in the ocean. And that shell on them is hard. It's a hard shell. This is a lobster fresh out of the ocean. You see those blue bands on his claws? The fisherman who caught this lobster put those blue elastic bands on his claws so that he couldn't open them and pinch him. Their claws are very, very strong. You'll notice that the claws are not the same. The claw on his right-hand side is a little bit bigger, and it has very big teeth on it. The claw on the left-hand side is a little bit smaller and has very fine teeth. So they use them to eat and to catch things as they run along the bottom of the ocean. And they use them for different purposes. It's not always that the big claw will be on the right side and the smaller claw will be on the left. So people sometimes talk about a left-handed lobster and a right-handed lobster. Few people notice that because most regular people like us only see a lobster when we're eating them. Next slide, please. This is a lobster when it's been prepared for cooking. The way you cook a lobster is you put it in a pot of boiling water. And when you put it in a pot of boiling water, they turn bright red like this. So most people think of lobsters as being red, but they are only red when you're eating them. In order to eat them, you have to break that hard shell that's all around them. And that requires tools like a carpenter has tools. You have to use pliers to break those claws to get the meat out of the claws. You have to actually pick the lobster up in your hand and generally break it apart. It's very messy. It makes the table dirty and wet. So oftentimes people eat lobster outdoors, but it's a very special food. People love lobsters, and so they don't mind getting messy. Sometimes they will wear like a piece of plastic over their shirt so that they don't make their clothes dirty too. You steam that lobster in boiling water for maybe 10 minutes, and then you start breaking the shell off and eating the pieces of meat, and you dip the meat in butter, and sometimes you squeeze lemon onto the meat. And it is very, very tasty. Let's look at the next slide. Here is a lobsterman. This is a man catching lobsters. So he's on the back of a little lobster boat. The yellow wire box in front of him is the trap that lobsters are captured in. He's right now taking a lobster out of that. He has to measure it to make sure the lobster is big enough to keep. If it's not big enough, he has to throw it back. And it has to grow a little bit more, and then he'll catch it again. The thing on the left side is bait. So once he pulls that lobster trap up off the bottom of the ocean, he checks to see if there are any lobsters in it. He checks to see how big they are. If they're big enough, he keeps them. He puts those rubber bands on their claws so they don't pinch him. And then he puts them on ice to keep them. And then the other person is taking bait, which is old fish, old dead fish, in a mesh bag. He will put that bag of old dead fish inside that wire box, close the wire box up, and put it back on the bottom of the ocean. Lobsters walk around on the bottom of the ocean eating things that are there. They don't generally swim through the water. They walk on the bottom. And so that's how they catch them in these traps. Next slide, please. Another thing that Maine is famous for is potatoes. And here's somebody sorting potatoes. Potatoes are not a very exciting crop. But as I said, Maine doesn't have very good farmland. It's very rocky. It's very uneven. It's not flat land. It's not rich land. It's not particularly good soil. It's rocky and sandy. It's also cold and dark. So one of the few crops that grows well here are potatoes. So Maine potatoes are a little bit famous. People know about Maine potatoes. And here are people harvesting potatoes. Next slide, please. A more fun crop are wild blueberries. And that's what we're looking at here. Maine is the largest blueberry producer in the United States. And these people are harvesting blueberries, picking blueberries. You can see a box of blueberries in front of you. And to the left of that box is the tool they use to pick them. It's like a big comb. And the harvesters rake that comb through the blueberries, and it pulls out the blueberries, and they dump them into the box. These are called low bush blueberries. They're wild. They only grow in Maine. There are other kinds of blueberries that are high bush that will be almost as tall as a person. They grow in different climates. They're easier to grow, and other places have them. Wild blueberries are pretty much unique to Maine. Maine has both kinds of blueberries, though. They grow the high bush blueberries and the low bush blueberries. And I don't know if you've ever had a blueberry, but they're delicious. People make pies with them, which is a kind of fruit tart. They will also bake them into cakes and pancakes and muffins and different kinds of breads. You would like them. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of Maine from the sky, the interior of Maine. Maine is a relatively big state. For the New England area, it's the biggest. And most of it looks like this. It's just trees. It's forest. So not very many people live in the interior of the state at all. Most of the people live along the coast, particularly in the south. So the interior is forest, wilderness. It goes up and down. This part looks pretty level and flat. And you can see a little color in there. So this picture, we know two things. This picture was taken in the autumn, in the fall, probably in September or October. And the other thing we know is that it's a mixed forest. It has both pine trees and deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are trees that have big leaves. And those leaves change color in the fall as winter is coming. Right before the leaves fall off, they change color. I think you've seen trees in Kyrgyzstan do this. Birch trees, for example, their leaves will turn from green to yellow and then fall off. The red in this picture are probably maple trees. Their leaves generally turn red. The green trees you see are some kind of pine trees, maybe spruce trees. But that's what Maine looks like from above. It's very pretty. Next slide, please. All right, I mentioned maple trees, those trees that were turning red. This man is collecting the sap from a maple tree. So this is another kind of industry in Maine. One of the things you'll notice is that he's wearing a jacket and a hat, and on the ground is snow. So you collect the sap from maple trees in spring sometime when it's still pretty cold out. And so what is sap? What is he doing? Sap is the liquid that runs up a tree from the roots up the trunk to the leaves. And it's what keeps the tree alive. It's like tree blood. It's nutrition for the tree. And so what he's doing is he's drilled a little hole in the wood of the tree, in the side of the tree. He's put a tube in that hole, and some of that liquid is dripping out into the bucket. And so he's collecting that. He can only do it in the spring. And it only works for a special kind of tree called a sugar maple tree. And so he's working on a sugar maple tree there. And he's gathering it. Next slide, please. And what he does once he gathers it is he dumps that liquid, which looks just like water to you and me, and doesn't taste much different than water either. He dumps it into a pot with a fire underneath it, and he boils it. And he boils it, and he boils it, and he boils it. He keeps dumping in more buckets of tree sap into this pot and boiling it. He's evaporating it. You can see the steam rising off the pot. The reason he does that is as it evaporates, it becomes more concentrated. And as it becomes more concentrated, it becomes much sweeter. So it tastes delicious once it's been boiled down like this. People cook with it, but most typically they put it on pancakes. It's breakfast cakes. And you can put blueberries in your pancakes, and then you can pour maple syrup on your pancakes. You can see how difficult it is to make it. I forget the exact ratio, but I think it takes about 10 buckets of sap out of that tree to make 1 bucket of syrup once it's been boiled down. It might even be more than that. It might even be less than that. It takes a lot of effort to make that sap sweet enough to be maple syrup, but it is delicious. Next slide, please. One of the other things that Maine relies on, the Maine economy relies on, is tourism. And much of the tourism happens along the coast where I live, where people go boating, sailing or sea kayaking or driving around in motorboats. And in the winter, people go skiing, just like they do in Kyrgyzstan. I have been skiing in Kyrgyzstan. I have been skiing in Maine. They're both wonderful. This is Maine in the winter. This is somebody skiing in one of the ski hills up in the interior. It's very cold. You have to dress very warmly to go skiing here, but it's super fun. You can see how far this person can see. It's very pretty. All the trees here look like they're spruce trees, which is a kind of pine tree. It's a beautiful day and a beautiful slope, and I wish I was joining him. Next slide, please. Now we're getting close to home. I said I lived on an island. This is a map of the island I live on. It's called Great Diamond Island. It's about 2 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. And what is a little, the history of the island is, before it was called Great Diamond Island, it was called Great Hog Island. Hog means pig, so it's a word for a pig. And they called it Hog Island because back when Portland was a new city, we're close to Portland. Back when it was a new city, the farmers would take their pigs out and just let them run loose on the island and get their food that way. They couldn't go bother anybody else because they were stuck on the island. They would get enough to eat, and then once they were ready to go to market, they would take them off the island and sell them. Well, in about 1920, a real estate developer thought this island would be a good island to put vacation homes on, like dachas. It's sort of a dacha place. And he thought, as real estate agents do, that calling an island Hog Island might not be good for the market. It might not attract buyers. So he changed the name to Great Diamond Island, and that name has stuck. Looking at the map, on the bottom part of the map, to the bottom and to the left, are those vacation homes. You'll see those black dots. Each one of those black dots is a home. They face west mostly, south and west. And they look back at the city of Portland, which is about 3 miles away. So it's not very far. And Portland is not very big. There are only about 60,000 people in Portland. So they have a view of Portland. And then in the middle of the island, you see a sort of line, a black dotted line running from left to right. And on the top of that line, it says U.S. Naval Reserve Fort McKinley. And this is the part of the island I live on. It used to be a fort, like a military fort. It was built in the 1890s for the Army. And it was used a little bit in World War I. There were soldiers here in World War I. Obviously, it wasn't used to fight anybody. Nobody came here. No shots were fired. It was just a place to train soldiers and to protect the harbor into Portland. So there were first infantry soldiers here, and then later there were artillery soldiers. So they put, artillery means big guns, like cannons. And so they put cannons on the west end of the island facing out to sea. Excuse me, the east end of the island facing out to sea. And they staffed it with soldiers. And then after, they used it a little bit in World War II, again, just to put people in there, but not to fight anybody. But then after the war, the government didn't want it anymore, and it became a ruin. It was just, the roofs on the buildings fell in, and it was abandoned. It was beautiful, but abandoned. And then in about 1984, a developer came in and decided he could turn all those ruined buildings into homes for people. And that's what he did. And that's where we live. So now we live in an old fort. The building I'm speaking to you from used to be a barracks, that is the housing for the enlisted men. But also in the fort, there are officers' quarters. There are non-commissioned officers' quarters that all have people in them now. There is the old schoolhouse that is now a house. There is the old bakery. There's the old jail, also where people live. So they converted everything that used to be here and used to have a military purpose into homes. So it's kind of fun. It's a little bit of history. The buildings are beautiful. And that's where I live. Next slide, please. This is how I get to and from town. We go on ferry boats that are like this. In the winter, there are about 3 ferry boats a day. In the summer, there can be as many as 7 ferry boats a day. They go every day of the year, so 365 days a year. And I don't know how many people they hold, maybe 150 people. And they go to this island and a couple of other islands in Casco Bay, and they go back and forth to Portland. So people can live here on the island. There's no bridge. You can't drive to Portland. And there are no businesses on this island. They're only homes. But people go to town to work on these boats every day. Young people go to school on these boats every day. This is how we have to go shopping. There are no stores here. So that's how we get our food. It's fun. It's fun to get on a boat and go to town. So next slide, please. This is a picture of one of the buildings here. this is the kind of building I live in. It isn't exactly the building I live in, but it looks just like this. That building has been, there are, I don't know, maybe 6 of these buildings. They used to be enlisted men's quarters, so they were big and open. The developer cut them up into smaller units so that now there are 7 different units in this building. We have one of those 7 units. This building has been decorated for the 4th of July. You see those red, white, and blue banners on the second level porch? That's what people sometimes do around the 4th of July to celebrate Independence Day in the United States. You'll see in the front of the building a little golf cart. There are no cars, gasoline-powered cars allowed on the island. There are only these electric golf carts for people to get around in. We don't use one. We just walk or take a bicycle to get around. It's, as I said, it's not a big island. It's about 2 kilometers long, 2 kilometers wide. So we can walk pretty much anywhere we need to get to. But some people like to have these golf carts. Next slide, please. And that's the end. And we're at about 30 minutes in. Are there questions?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I will remove your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful journey to your home state. It was really exciting, and you provide us really insightful information and showing your landscape and everything, and especially the way you described the food there. Oh, it was really, how to say, I didn't have my lunch. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I would like to remind our viewers, please ask your questions and leave your comments, and Bill will answer all of them. And I would like to check how much attentive were our viewers and ask one question. In the flag of the state of Maine, there is a word dirigo, and what does it mean? Who is the most attentive person? Let's check. Yes, and we have some comments here from Eldar. Wow, uh, thanks for the information, Miss Maine a lot. And yeah, the true Maine has got tons of rocks.
That is very true. There are many rocks here. Also, I don't know if you miss it. I don't know when or why you were here, but one of the things Maine is good at is education. It has some very good colleges and universities, even though it's a small state and it doesn't have very many people. It's got 3 pretty famous colleges. One of them is named Colby, one of them is named Bates, and one of them is named Bowdoin. They're called the Little Ivies, so meaning they're like the Ivy League, but they're smaller. They're private colleges. I went to Colby College for a while myself when I was young. I did not graduate from there. I went someplace else to finish. But they're very, very good schools. And if any of you are interested in studying in the United States, I can tell you that those are very, very fine schools.
Okay, thank you. It might be really exciting to take the ship every day to your work, school, and yeah, for shopping. Yeah.
On a boat, yes.
On a boat, cool. And we have the question here. Sorry, what is your favorite place to visit in Maine, Bill?
I'm still finding my favorite places to visit in Maine. One of the things I've done recently, because of our pandemic situation, there aren't as many people in Maine as there usually are this time of year. In the summer, this part of Maine fills up with people. As I said, the houses here are mostly dachas. They're mostly summer people. So in the wintertime, there are maybe 60 people who live on this island. In the summertime, there are probably 600 people who live on this island. It's a big, big difference. And there are many islands in where we are in Casco Bay, and some of them are pretty close. And that ferry boat that you saw goes to the other islands. So what I have been doing, you ask what I like to do, I'm exploring. I take the ferry boat with my bicycle to another island,
Oh,
and I
wow.
drive my bicycle around the other island to find out what that other island is like. I haven't done this before, and it's new. And just so you know, when I say there are a lot of islands, the islands in Casco Bay, which is the bay off of Portland, are called the Calendar Islands. Um, they're called the Calendar Islands because at one point, for a long, long time, like 100 years or more, they thought there were 365 of them. They thought there was one island for every day of the year. That's how many islands they thought there were. In reality, when they really counted and did the mapping and charting, there aren't 365. It's closer to 200. But that's still a lot of islands. And so that's a lot of exploring. That I can get on a boat and take my bicycle and go to another island and pedal around and see it and come back. And that's an exciting day for me. So that's what I like to do.
Yes, you're living a really adventurous life there. Yeah. So we have a comment from Elmira Kireva.
I see
Here again.
Elmira. Hi, Elmira.
Yes. So great to see you, Bill. Hi from Almaty, she's saying.
Great.
Thank you, Elmira. And we have another question. We learned that the state of Maine is famous for seafood. If tourists are allowed to go fishing?
Yes, absolutely. You need a license usually to go fishing. That's true any place in the United States. That's how they control it. But you can get a license and go fishing. People, there are docks where that ferry boat comes in and takes us into town. People fish off of that all the time. So yes, I only focused on lobster, but obviously there are other fish in the ocean, and most of the restaurants in Portland specialize in seafood, different kinds of seafood. So yes, you can fish. The other popular kind of seafood to get in restaurants are shellfish. So clams and scallops and mussels are three different kinds of shellfish that are particularly popular in Maine restaurants. And another thing that's kind of new is seaweed. Maine has started to grow seaweed. It's mostly because I think people in Japan use seaweed in their cooking a lot, and people in America have been learning from the Japanese how to use seaweed, and so that's becoming popular too. And that grows here naturally, but when they want to do it commercially, they plant it and grow it. It looks the same, you can't tell, but it's like a farm. It's underwater, but it's a farm for seaweed.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
We have another question from Manas Sagunov. Manas is asking, hi, Bill. I guess my favorite writer, Stephen King, lives in Maine, and many stories of his novels take part in Maine.
I'm so glad you know that. Yes, he's probably the most famous person who lives in Maine, Stephen King, and he's still around. He lives up in a town called Bangor, which is it's a big town in the middle of the state, closer to the interior, and we're very proud of him. We're sorry that all his stories are kind of scary, and he's writing about Maine, so people think Maine is cold, Maine has lobsters, and Maine is scary. It's not scary. It's nice. But yes, he's very involved. I follow him on Twitter, so I know what he's up to. Yes, I'm glad you know that a writer is our most famous resident of the state. And I see another question. What states are the main trade partners of Maine?
Yes.
Everybody buys lobster, so the lobsters from Maine can go anywhere. Up until this year, China was the biggest consumer of Maine lobster. But because of trade challenges with China right now, they aren't importing any Maine lobster at all. So they're sending them to domestic markets. The trick with lobsters is they don't travel that well. It's not like a fish where you have to keep it underwater the whole time. They can live in the air for a while, but they don't like it that much, and it doesn't make them taste better. So you have to get them where they're going pretty quickly. Everybody buys Maine blueberries. Everybody buys Maine potatoes. Everybody buys Maine timber. You saw that picture of the forest. I sort of ran over this, but one of the big products of Maine is timber-related products. So boards, lumber for building houses, but mostly paper made from wood pulp. Maine is famous. It's not a very glamorous part of our economy, but Maine is famous for making a lot of paper, all kinds of different paper. And so people use that. Maine has a lot of paper mills. I don't know if you've ever been near a paper mill, but they don't smell very good. And when you make paper, it makes a bad smell. But it's a big part of the industry. And for a while, Maine had the largest toothpick factory in the world. You know those things you clean your teeth with, that piece of wood you clean your teeth with? We have wood. Maine has a lot of wood. So, yeah, and one of the things that's characteristic of this part of the United States is homes are built mostly out of wood. In other parts of the United States, they'll use bricks or concrete or masonry of some kind, stone. But because lumber was so plentiful here, most homes are built entirely out of wood. So you knock on a wall and it's wood. It's not bricks underneath that.
Yeah, so many products made by wood, paper, toothpicks,
Yeah.
and you said also that the people used to collect liquid from the trees. If this process also damages the trees and forests.
No, you can do that to a tree for decades, and they'll be okay. And that's a sugar maple tree it's a very nice wood. It's a hardwood like oak, with a finer grain, so it makes beautiful furniture. The hole they drill in it is not very big, and it's just in one place, so it doesn't go up and down the tree. And yeah, the tree is pumping all this liquid up to the leaves as spring is coming, and the guys who take that liquid just take a little bit of it, in tree terms, and the wood is still good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And we have another question here. What places you can advise for family vacation? For example, for parents with teenagers.
Yeah, but Maine, its nickname is Vacation Land. So a huge part of the economy is related to tourism. And because of the current pandemic, tourism is a problem. People haven't been able to come. The rule is you're supposed to wait 14 days before you do anything. So that shut a lot of things down. But much of the tourism, I mean, the things that I like to do are kind of adventure tourism. So sea kayaking is very popular, taking a small boat like a canoe, but it's a double-ended paddle. There's a paddle on both ends, and paddling from island to island. There is something called the Maine Island Trail Association, which is designed so that you take these small boats and you paddle out to one island and you camp there, and then you paddle to a different island and you camp there. And it's like a trail. You're following a trail, but by the sea rather than by walking. So that's a popular thing. As I said, skiing of all kinds, both downhill skiing and cross-country skiing are popular here. What are the bicycle riding? It's more like mountain biking. The roads are too skinny. There's not a good place to ride a bicycle, I don't think. I ride a bicycle on the islands because there aren't very many cars. It's safe. But the roads on the mainland are too skinny. One of the day adventures that people do in the city of Portland is they go out on a schooner. A schooner is a kind of big sailboat. They don't make them anymore. They were working boats in Maine, and they used to use them as freighters to move stuff around the coast 100 years ago before there were motors. Um, and they don't do that anymore, but they take people out for the day. So you go out on a big sailboat and you just sail around the harbor of Portland, and it's beautiful. And you eat really nice seafood while you're on the boat. So that's a not very strenuous kind of entertainment in Portland. We also get cruise ships in Portland, particularly in the fall season. So cruise ships are those big boats that have lots of people on them who eat a lot of food while they're on their boat. The reason why they come to Portland is the boats like to go along the coast of Maine, particularly in the fall season, October and September and October, when the leaves on the trees are changing colors. It's very, very beautiful when those trees change from green to yellow and orange and red. And you can see them from the boats, and it's just gorgeous. And so people do that. Um, but there are all kinds of things to have fun here. I had a friend visit recently, and we went to a bar where we threw axes at the wall for fun. An axe is that tool you use to chop down a tree, so it's sharp at one end, and it's got a long handle on it. And they had a place where you could go throw axes at a target on the wall and see how good you were. It's hard, but yeah, it was fun. So we can do anything.
Yeah,
Come
it
visit.
seems, yeah, it seems it's a perfect place to visit. Yeah,
Yeah.
and nobody answered to my question yet. My question was, Bill mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, he mentioned that in the flag of the state of Maine, there is a word, uh, dirigo. And what does it mean? Let's check who is attentive person. I will still hope that somebody will answer. And the next question is, can you tell us three main similarities between Kyrgyzstan and your state?
Okay, the first one would be the climate, I think, and that's a big one. It's we're almost at the same level of northness. We're at the same latitude, and so the climate's very similar. Um, and for the interior part of the state, the part of the state that's not near the sea where I am, I think it's probably very similar to Kyrgyzstan. It's rural. Um, I, I think some of the vegetation is similar. I think the kinds of things that grow here, the kinds of trees and forests and hills we have, you would recognize it. You would understand it. Um, I live in the coastal part of Maine, and that's very different from the rest of Maine, which is much bigger than the coastal part. And when people think of Maine, they often only think of the coastal part um, because this is where all the tourists come. But the most of the state doesn't get the tourists, and it's big. It's pretty much empty, and it's beautiful in its own way. It's very pretty, and so that's the part I think that's like Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is also beautiful, um, so I think that's the main similarity.
And what was your favorite place here in Kyrgyzstan?
Well,
If you remember.
I went on vacation once in Kyrgyzstan, and I went skiing up in the Tian Shan above Karakol. And so we lived in a yurt up above Karakol for a week. Up, I don't know how many meters. It would have been about 10,000 feet, I think. Um, and we just skied for a week, about 6 or 8 guys, and we had a blast. It was very fun. So I love that. I loved Issyk-Kul. Issyk-Kul was fun. We were just talking about Narin, and I thought Narin on the other side of the lake was beautiful too. So I loved the whole country. It was beautiful. I miss it. I need to get
Yeah,
back.
thank you. You're greatly missed too. Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
can you tell a little bit about the libraries in your state? And I see the beautiful library behind you. And tell a little bit about your own library. What do you like to read?
Yeah, yeah. This is my own library, and this is the top floor of the house that we live in. And I had this room built by somebody so that I have my own library now. So I'm very happy about that. Um, I'm mostly reading novels now, and when I was in the Foreign Service for 26 years, my reading was kind of driven by where I was going next or where I was at that time. So I was always reading books about the country I was in, or the country I was going to, or the country I'd just been in. Um, and it was wonderful. I loved that, but it wasn't necessarily the reading I would have been doing if I hadn't been moving around. So one of the things, let's see, I'll pull a book off the shelf. Can you see this? I like to read books about Greek mythology. This is Stephen
Mhm.
Fry, who's British. He wrote a book called Mythos, which is more or less a little encyclopedia to Greek mythology. And I've been reading books that have been generated out of mostly Greek mythology. So I'm trying to think for example, here's one, Silence of the Girls. This is the story of the Iliad told by Briseis, mostly, who's in terms of Homer, a relatively minor character, but she's the center of this novel. And so it's the Iliad told by the point of view of a woman who was captured by the Greeks, given to Odysseus as tribute, not to Odysseus, to Achilles, taken from Achilles by Agamemnon, and then given back. And it's all that controversy, and she's in the middle of it. So it flips the narrative. It tells the narrative of the Iliad from a woman's point of view. The women characters are not well developed in the Iliad, and it's a useful remedy for that situation. So yeah, that's that kind of thing I've been reading since I've got here. I'm also trying to catch up on Maine. I'm not from Maine originally. I'm from Massachusetts, which is about 2 hours driving south of here. It's not very far away, but it's a little bit far away. And so I need to study up on Maine as well, to learn more about it.
Thank you. So next time, then we should invite you to tell about the Massachusetts.
I could do that. Yes, that's where I
Yeah.
grew up.
Thank you very much. I am. Yeah, I see some comments from Elmira. Stephen Fry.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, Elmira says, best from Regina.
Hi,
Okay.
Regina, too. That's so cool.
Yeah. I think we do not have any more questions. Yeah, it
Okay.
was really interesting and wonderful journey to your home state. Thank you, Bill. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Yeah. And thank you,
Thank
everyone who tuned in and asked questions and leave comments. I hope you liked this session. And so the next virtual tour will bring you to a higher state this Friday. And please check out the Bishkek AC Facebook page and join us at the same time as today. Yeah, so thank you, Bill, for
Thanks so
joining. Yeah, it
much.
was
All
really
right.
nice to see you. Have a
All
good
right.
day and have a good night, our dear viewers.
Bye
Yeah,
bye.
bye.